Welcome, everyone. Katie, always a pleasure to be with you. This is a podcast about health sovereignty. Health sovereignty is the whole idea of freedom and autonomy that we can reclaim from the forces in our culture and our society that are creating dependencies. And those dependencies are preventing us from thriving and flourishing as human beings. And my own field, my own profession, will continue to be complicit in fomenting that dependency until we are able to bring forward the other half of the coin. Currently, we're only operating on one side of the coin, as we say, which is pathogenesis, the idea that everything that we do is diagnosis and treatment of diseases, disorders, and dysfunction. And the other side of the coin is called salutogenesis, which means reclaiming our own innate capacities to be healthy and to heal. So going from pathogenesis, not throwing that away, but including or marrying or dovetailing it with this whole idea of our innate capacities to be healthy and to heal. So luto means health, genesis is the origin of. So in order to do that, we have to come up really with a new language and with a new model. And so this idea of creating a model and a language for salutogenesis has to start with a framework that's solid enough to do two main things. One is to be comprehensive enough and robust enough to not leave out anything really important, but also to be simple enough so that everything that we do is pragmatic and practical and easy to incorporate into our super busy lives. And so we're always looking for simple, easy, and honestly, low cost, low overhead, low sophistication. And again, that whole idea of this makes sense for me to, after a little bit of guidance, begin to transform and move into unlocking those innate capacities to be healthy and to heal. That framework comes from integral theory. We believe that that's the most solid framework to build this concept of salutogenesis upon. And that's really a framework of reality, of life. And it's got 4 quadrants. And when we incorporate this framework, this 4-quadrant framework to health, the 4 quadrants are the body, selfhood, relationships to one another, and relationships to nature. And so we refer to those as the 4 connections. And when we feel reconnected to body, selfhood, one another, and nature, the thriving and flourishing comes automatically, comes naturally, it flows forth. And so in that upper quadrant of the body, we have 5 pillars. And those are hydration, nutrition, exercise, sleep, and stress reduction. And we know that when we're dehydrated, Pop-Tart eating, sedentary, insomniac, stress balls, nothing works well, right? And so today, we're going to spend a little time unpacking that second pillar of nutrition and going deep on that together. And I love this framework. I love that we can deal with these topics from the point of view of the scientific basis of medicine. As a physician, I can bring that. And then also the scientific basis of behavior change. As a coach, you can bring that. So I look forward to this conversation.
I've been looking forward to this all week, especially on the topic of nutrition, because it's such a fundamental part of not only our well-being, but also culture and community. And I think it's something that is getting lost more and more as the generations go on. And as you were describing, this invitation to sort of simplify and recondition our habits that actually bring about vitality.
Yeah.
And it's such a wonderful opportunity to not only fuel our bodies, but also facilitate the generational educational element of how to be healthy by sitting at a table and breaking, metaphorical bread with
Yes,
each other.
totally. No, that's exactly right. So the way that I think about it, again, yearning for that simplicity on the other side of complexity. As you say, this is one of the most fraught topics in all of health. It's the one that has the highest degree, I think, of confusion, misinformation. Um, I think about it as that second pillar of five of the body has five components of its own. And those are, what do I eat? Where does it come from? How much? When? And then personalized nutrition. So, what do I eat? What does my diet consist of? Where does it come from? What's the source of my food? How much do I eat? What's the caloric input in my day to day? The fourth one is the one on meal timing. How do I create an understanding of when to eat? And then the fifth one has to do with the fact that we're all, to some degree, unique individuals. And the first sort of myth that we're going to bust, I think, is that there's one perfect diet for everybody, which is simply not true. But it doesn't have to be so hard or complicated to unravel that optimal diet for each of us. So those are kind of the five, components of this framework.
Super excited to dive in. Where do you want to start?
Well, let's start at the top. I mean, what do I eat? What does my diet consist of? I would say, just very simplistically, that the answer is real food. It's just real food. The main problems with nutrition, which is one of the main driving forces of all of our ailments, the chronic diseases are all fueled by metabolic dysregulation. We know that. So cancer is driven by metabolic dysregulation. Heart disease, cardiovascular disease, as well as neurodegenerative conditions are driven by metabolic dysregulation. Metabolic dysregulation comes from eating the wrong things fundamentally. It's one of the main causes of that. And so the problem that we have with what you and I know is the SAD diet, right? The standard American diet is a very sad diet because it's composed of many things that are not real. They're not real food. They're processed or ultra processed foods that don't exist in nature in their natural state. And so real food is basically meat, vegetables, fruits, nuts, eggs, some spices, some healthy fats, and that's about it. So that's the quick answer. What do you think?
Well, with my clients, I like to remind them that they can just walk around the outside of the grocery
Exactly.
store
The
as a way to
perimeter.
have access to these. I often say whole foods just
Mhm.
because it's this constant breaking down and adding filler and
Mhm.
like refining and refining down to just like a powdery, dry, hard, lifeless substance and
Mhm.
then packaging it up in a box and calling it food that is
Yep.
making people sick.
Yep.
So we want things that come out of the earth, that live on the earth,
Yep.
that maybe we're breathing and drinking and eating other whole foods.
Yep.
And it's that life force that's still inside of these foods. And so if this seems foreign or scary, the simplest solution is to just walk around the perimeter of the grocery store.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the idea of the ancestral diet. This is the way we used to do it. The human species is maybe 300,000 years old, and for 299.5 of those 300,000 years, that's how we ate, as foragers, basically before John Deere combines came into the mix. So the ancestral diet, some people kind of frame it as the paleo diet, which comes from Paleolithic, which means old Stone Age. So it's basically the way we ate in the old days, where, as you say, we got food that we plucked from a tree or pulled out of the ground or shot with a bow and arrow. And the more that we return to that way of eating, well, the faster we return to health.
I think that can be complicated for people because they'll see like super athletes eating protein powders and protein bars and gels and these substances and astronauts using astronaut food. And there's a certain level of societal evolution that seems like it coincides with these processed foods. But I think that it's important to remember that those are exceptional circumstances warranting exceptional choices. But even those individuals don't thrive for the long haul without primarily eating these whole foods.
Can't agree. Can't agree more. Yeah, so I think that basis of a diet, which we'll talk about how that may need to be modified in some cases, but the basis of that, eating real food that comes from nature, that is generally in the perimeter of the grocery store, or farmers markets, right? Or, as I say, if you have friends who are hunters, covet them, because getting wild game is another amazing way of finding that well-rounded nutrition that comes from nature.
And you had asked me, how do I eat? I'd say that is the philosophy with which I eat, and at times it's easier than others. When I find myself in food deserts, having to really make compromises to my ideal diet. But fortunately, we live in this beautiful place, Boulder, Colorado, with farms that allow us to go and get like fresh food. And, I have friends that are hunters that offer me meat to store in my freezer. And just when I look back at the history of my own life, I've eaten in different ways.
Yeah.
There was a time I was a vegetarian. There was a time I was truly paleo.
Yeah.
The more diverse and well-rounded my nutrition is at any given time seems to be when I thrive the most. So I don't personally do that well on like contrived, hyper rigid diets. I personally do the best with diversities with these whole foods. And so that's this other piece, is having a rainbow of colors in the fruits and veg world, and having seasons to the way that I eat, and assuring that this whole food philosophy also doesn't create rigidity as well.
So important. Well, let's kind of double click on this whole idea of, I know you and I both know people, we've worked with people who say, the minute that I became a carnivore and I stopped eating plants altogether, everything was fixed. All of my health problems resolved. And other people who say, the minute I became a vegetarian or a vegan, stopped eating meat altogether, my health began to take off and I began to thrive. What a crazy paradox that is.
And you see that too when you look at the areas where there are the most centarians, these blue zones, I believe is what they referred to them as. You see some that thrive in the carnivorous diet, and you see others that thrive in a purely vegetarian diet. So what's going on there? I mean, I have my take and my philosophy and things I've read, and it does come down to the cohesive whole, the ecosystem that is the person, the balance between their genetics, their activity, their life experience, the food they eat, and even the culture they're around. But I will say that what we do always see is it's whole foods. You're not seeing this in areas that are ultra processed.
Yes.
So just to reflect back on that detail, but you probably have more understanding of these divergent diets and why they might work for individuals than even I do. So I'd love to hear your take.
Yeah, let's go deep into that when we talk about that fifth component of personalized nutrition, which really has to do with food sensitivities, food allergies, food intolerances, enzyme deficiencies, and people oftentimes confuse those categories, and how our microbiome or our genetic ancestral lineage might inform which of those ways of eating are best, and also certain ailments. So we'll definitely go deep into that, and maybe we just do that now. I mean, we don't have to go in order, right? So this whole idea of personalized nutrition became really clear to me as I started reading all of these diet gurus. So there's a well-known one named Steve Gundry, who created something called the plant paradox. And his whole question what his whole philosophy is based upon the fact that lectins are a component of plants that many people don't do well with. And his theory is basically, look, if you and I we walked outside here and we went to a park and started randomly picking leaves off of trees and bushes and berries and things like that, within 20 minutes we'd have violent diarrhea and vomiting, right? So,
Not ideal.
so how is it that we decided to label these plants as good for us and these plants over here we don't do? And is it a black and white binary thing? Meaning, is it either good for us, plants, or toxic? Or is there some sort of a gray zone? And his whole thesis is no, there's a gray zone, and many people don't do well with lots of foods that have, high lectin content. And the highest lectin content comes from both glutinous foods, nightshades, tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, and the legumes like beans and lentils. Lentils have some of the highest amount of lectin. And so I was at a conference not that long ago, and Naveen Jain was there, who is the founder of Viome. And somebody brought this up to him, and he had a beautiful response, which was, look, my grandfather came from the highland, I think of Nepal or northern India, and he lived to 100. And for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, pretty much for most of his life, he only ate dal, right? Which is made of lentils. And he thrived and he was full of energy and he had amazing health and vitality for those 100 years. And so clearly there's something going on there where Naveen's grandfather did perfectly fine with a very, very high lectin diet. But other people who have European ancestry may actually not do so well with those foods.
I'm one of those people.
Yeah, same. What happens to you when you eat a lot of lectin?
Just a lot of digestive distress. I
Mhm.
find it dehydrates me really fast.
Mhm.
I deal with bloating and gas and just find that I then don't recover or have as much energy the next day.
Yeah.
But my story from my family is almost the reverse. Like so many people struggle with dairy, but
Yeah.
I'm Swedish in
Hmm.
heritage, and it's a superfood for me.
Yeah.
So it's speak to that if you wouldn't
Yeah.
mind. Like, is it a change in genetics? Is it like a
Totally.
orientation, that just allows, like I said, sort of a whole package of all the foods we eat that
Yes.
mix together? I mean, the answer is sort of yes, 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 right?
Yeah, I think having some like ability to sort of box this or contain it in a framework is super, super helpful. So let's just let's just rattle these different um, tendencies that we have off. So we have a tendency in some cases to develop allergies to foods, and that's a very specific and particular thing. It's a particular food reaction that is an atopic reaction. So it's an allergic reaction to food that has a typical consequence of ailments and symptoms and has a very, very clear mediator. And that mediator is IgE, which is an antibody, and histamine. So when people have food allergies, let's say you're allergic to shrimp and you eat shrimp, you will immediately get a histaminergic response, usually very rapidly, mediated by this IgE antibody. And the symptoms are allergy symptoms. So they're usually in the skin, the lungs, or the mucous membranes. So you can get rashes like hives and urticaria. You can get hay fever symptoms, runny nose, itching mouth, cough, and you can get pulmonary symptoms that feel asthmatic in nature. So you can trigger asthma with food at times. And the worst form of food allergies can lead to an anaphylactic reaction. So people literally have so much mucosal swelling that they can, you know, have airway compromise and need an EpiPen to save their life. So food allergies, one specific thing mediated by one specific antibody, and that should not be confused from food sensitivities. Food sensitivities are mediated by different antibodies, things like IgG, and they're much more subtle. They lead to symptoms like body aches, malaise, I don't feel good. What do you mean you don't feel good? I don't know, man. I just don't feel good. Brain fog. Um, a lot of digestive issues can be a result of food sensitivities as well. And of course, we have diagnostic tools that can test for IgE reactions to all the different foods, IgG reactions, food sensitivities to all the different foods. And then we have food intolerances. Those are a different category, generally mediated by various other antibodies, IgG or IgA, and that's your celiac disease. It's like, no, I can't have any gluten. Um, and then the third or the fourth category is enzyme deficiencies. Enzyme deficiencies are typically, everybody's heard of lactose intolerance or lactase deficiency, but lactase is only one of many things that we eat, right? It's milk sugar, but there are other sugars, there are other fats, other proteins that we may, as unique individuals, have trouble digesting. And then we need digestive support, digestive enzyme support. And lectin intolerance may, to some degree, fall into that category as well. And then lastly, we have the whole microbiome milieu, which we're only just beginning to sort of start to understand. But there are diagnostic tools for all of these that are very effective and very useful. And what I find comical, honestly, is people have axes to grind and will point to one or more of these categories and say, that's all bullshit. That doesn't exist. And it's like, well, no, you're just confused. You thought this was a food allergy, and that wasn't true. It's actually a food sensitivity or intolerance or an enzyme deficiency or some other microbiome disruption. So those are the broad categories. Now we can, as individuals, have issues with one or more of those. And we also find that people cluster in those categories. So certain populations can cluster in various food reactions that don't feel very good. A few years ago, a friend of mine named Maria Cooper, who's a wonderful chef here in Boulder, we collaborated on a cookbook. She did all of the heavy lifting, and my contribution was to take the 5 main categories of clusters, which are people who have sensitivity to lectin, people who have sensitivity to histamines, people who have sensitivity to foods, these oligosaccharides called FODMAPs. There are people who tend towards autoimmunity, and there's people who tend to have more psychological response to foods, things like ADD and lack of focus and even depression, anxiety. And so there's the GAPS diet, there's the AIP diet, there's the FODMAPs diet, there's the low histamine and the low lectin diet. And for each recipe, all of which are paleo in Maria's cookbook called The Heartful Kitchen, each recipe has a key at the bottom of the page and says, hey, if you're following a low histamine diet, substitute this food for that. If you're following a GAPS diet, substitute this ingredient for that ingredient. So these are the 5 major clusters. There are others, but very common clusters where larger groups of people will tend to find that they struggle, whereas a food allergy is a totally unique thing to you that doesn't really have to do with other people. Does this make sense?
So that is one of the most powerful ways I've ever heard that articulated. And as someone who's studied nutrition, studied health my whole life, I don't think I've ever had even a doctor sit me down and explain that these are these different categories and give me any kind of empowered way to sort of see my own personal landscape or understand it in great detail. And as a coach, I can help people do sort of their everyday testing. And what I mean by that is eat this food, how does it make you feel? To come up with something that works for them or encourage them to do something like a food sensitivity test. But that book sounds like a phenomenal tool if you know how to use it. And so what I'd love to hear is how you might encourage me as a coach to work with somebody who's never done any tests, who's dealing with dis-ease in some capacity, and it feels somehow targeted to their nutrition not quite lining up with their personal needs. Like, how would you go about them figuring out how to nourish themselves properly?
Yeah. And this is where the order of those 5 components of this second pillar of health really helps. So for sure, start with the first one, which is eat real food.
Yep.
Eat the paleo or the ancestral diet, the perimeter, the grocery store, and that shift alone oftentimes solves 80% of the trouble,
Sure.
right? But sometimes it doesn't, right? And so then we move to the next one, which is the source. And we are so privileged and fortunate to live in a community, you and I, that's full of other beautiful people and true luminaries in regenerative agriculture, like Carl and Alice Starek at the Golden Hoof Farm, for instance, and all of these amazing CSAs that we have in our community, where it's not just organic food production, but the animal husbandry or the raising of animals is done with such a conscious and thoughtful and caring and loving way that oftentimes people who are vegetarian due to philosophical or spiritual reasons, when they go to a farm like the Golden Hoof, they're like, oh my God, these people are doing it right. And I don't feel so dogmatic about, only eating plants. So that's a real thing. And certainly we can go down the rabbit hole of all of the toxins that are literally sprayed on our food when we don't choose organic sources. And the fact that glyphosate is in the rain and in breast milk and in Antarctica now. Um, but, suffice it to say that where our food comes from is so, so, so important. And again, so many ways we can talk about this. A simple way is just the quality of the fat content of a free range grass-fed organic cow, if you're going to eat beef, compared to a feedlot industrial raised cow. I mean, and it's something like 4x higher omega-3 fatty acids in the polyunsaturated fat profile of grass-fed cattle, very similar to wild ruminants like elk and deer, um, than the industrial one. So the fat profile of animals, as well as the protein profile, is wholly dependent on what the animal eats, right? So same issue we have with farm-raised salmon versus wild-caught Alaskan salmon, for instance. So the source of the food is the second pillar, and then we can get into at some point the caloric volume of food and then the meal timing. And that's really kind of a good sequence to follow. A, let's start with cleaning up your diet so that it's real food. B, let's make sure we have a way to help you source that within financial boundaries that we all have. C, let's really look at the caloric intake because many, many, many of us are overeating. And we need to go back towards, I think, this Japanese idea of 80% is enough. We don't have to go to 110%, like supersize me in America, right? The Japanese have an entire culture that's based on this idea of, no, I don't have to stuff myself to the gills. 80% of satiety is enough. And of course, what's crazy about that is even if you think, oh, well, I could eat more and I kind of like to eat more, if you just wait 20 minutes, that hunger signal goes away and we're like, oh, I'm actually glad I didn't have that second helping of whatever it was. And then the meal timing is so, so, so important. I would say from what I have seen and experienced as a physician, that may actually be the most powerful of all of the components of this pillar. And meal timing is really the focus of that, or the concept here that we want to really devote a bit of time to, is the simple fact that our digestive systems were not designed to feed from waking until bedtime. And the way that our culture has been over the last decades or more is, well, I wake up in the morning and I have breakfast right away. And then I have a snack at 10, and then a lunch at noon, and then a snack at 2, and then dinner at 5, and then several snacks before bed. And so basically, I'm eating continuously throughout the course of the day. And the various fasting practices, which we can go into, I'm not dogmatic about any particular one. I think they're all cool and interesting. I personally use intermittent fasting, just a simple 16/8 intermittent fasting. But some break. You give your digestive system some break, you give your metabolism some break, has a legion of health benefits. So, sorry for that very long winded answer, but even before you get to personalized nutrition with my patients, with your clients, and everyone else, if we deal with those first four, oftentimes you don't even need to do any microbiome testing or food sensitivity testing because you've already addressed the issue.
Reading between the lines a little bit, am I hearing that we are essentially irritating our system in so many ways that we're inflamed and becoming intolerant of things that we may even be able to eat if we've changed when we're eating it, the quality of, the food that we're eating generally, and maybe created a more holistic like picture of our meals as a whole and as our diet as a whole? Is that what I'm gathering?
Completely. I mean, a very, very silly example, not maybe not so silly, it's actually it's crazy. So many people who have a sensitivity, not an intolerance, they're not celiac, but they have a sensitivity to gluten. When they go to France or Italy or Spain, they're like, I don't have any trouble here. When I'm in the US, as long as I'm not, eating some ancient grain form, I have all of these symptoms of brain fog and body aches and malaise and all of that.
Yeah.
So that speaks to the source of the food and the way these food products are produced. And that's different in Europe than it is here.
And I like to explain that to my clients. It's multifaceted. You have a more complex, like diverse actual plant
Mm-hmm.
than what we have in sort of the monocropped American
Yeah,
option. But then we also have different chemicals being sprayed on it.
that's right.
And then we have a different process around creating food from it.
Yeah.
And each one of those steps makes it less and less perceivable from our bodies as
Mm-hmm.
food.
Mm-hmm.
I'm an example of that.
Yeah.
I can handle a wonderful baguette or croissant
Yeah.
in Europe,
Yeah.
but in the United States, barring just minor contamination, like true gluten is truly poisonous for me. But I often wonder, is it the glyphosate?
Yeah.
Because that's even being found on organic produce at this point, let alone like processed wheat.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a lot of work being done here on seeds and returning back to there's an entire seed bank effort.
Thank goodness.
Yeah. And there are very conscious people, again, here in our community, people like Kelly Whitaker from Basta and Bruto and Wolf's Taylor, who has, he and his wife have, Erica, have dry storage, which is a bakery in Boulder. And they source, um, their grain from the highest quality sources possible and the most organic sources possible. So many people who will immediately develop a reactive, symptomatology by eating something from King Soopers bakery, actually go to dry storage and are like, wow, this is kind of like I feel in Europe. So yeah, it's a wild thing when we think about the air, water, and soil pollution that's happening environmentally in general. And I think it's incumbent upon us to celebrate the heroes that are actually going back to the old ways and finding ways to do it the right way.
Absolutely. I mean, you had mentioned the seed banks, and I think for people who don't really understand what that is, this is an invitation to maintain the genetics from heirloom varieties of all the different plants, and to assure that as we're like constantly monocropping and like focusing on such a small select amount of fruits and vegetables, that somewhere out there someone's preserving these more diverse options. And when I look at the people in my life that I would call like true foodies, but who are coming at it from the angle of optimal health and preservation of these traditions, I have friends who are in bean clubs, and they
Yeah.
get beans delivered in these
Yeah.
unique varieties, things I've never seen before, flavors I've never experienced
Hmm.
before. And I have to then ask myself, what phytonutrients are in this option? And
Totally.
how might just my body being able to interact with something a little bit nuanced and different provide a little bit of a challenge, but also a little bit of a nutrient boost that supports my overall vibrancy and well-being. And
Hmm.
so I wanted to, just based on what you were describing, like let people have almost like a protocol for themselves. Like
Hmm.
first look at your diet and ask, what boxes and bags am I eating out of? Can I find a whole food alternative? And start clearing up their diet that way. And you
Yes.
mentioned the fact that there are financial restrictions
Hmm.
on what people can choose for themselves. Not everyone can physically afford all organic or live in a
Yeah.
place where they have immediate access to these more unique varieties that we've been discussing, like
Hmm.
locally grown foods or locally, raised animals. And so I tell my clients, start cutting out the dirty dozen.
Yeah.
There are ways you can research what this year's worst produce are
That's right.
for exposure to chemicals, both volume of pesticides and herbicides and also variety of pesticides and herbicides. And for a long time, like I would think to myself, I'm never eating a conventional apple because they were
Yes.
always number one. They always had the most variety and volume of toxicity on an apple, like, or at least cut the skin off. And so there are these micro changes you can make to clean up your diet. And just like there's the dirty dozen, there's typically some fruits and vegetables that don't absorb as many of those
Yes.
chemicals and are a little bit safer. And so while again we're talking about ideally food being fresh, there are circumstances where having an organic frozen variety of a vegetable is going to yield a more
Yeah.
nourishing option than a conventional non-frozen, theoretically fresh variety. And so perfection is not the key here.
That's right.
We're aiming for improvements. Better is what I like to tell my clients. And so first get the boxes and bags as much out of your life as you can.
Yeah.
Then start weeding out like the super toxic foods.
Yes.
And I think you're right. Most of my clients see such a marked improvement that they then get clear decision making. Maybe they can even make changes to their jobs that allow them to have a higher income. And
Yeah.
feeling better actually tends to then lead to the option for more alteration and change within their diet. And so it's this beautiful feedback loop.
Totally. It's a virtuous cycle.
And for
Yeah.
some of us, we're still needing a little of extra help.
Yeah.
Maybe there was trauma or a specific virus
Yeah.
or a bacterial infection or a
Exactly.
disorder that puts them in a position of needing additional support. But I don't want to negate the timing piece because,
No.
so I don't know, where should we go next? Do you
Sure.
want to go to the timing piece?
Yeah. Again, here's where we go, back up a little bit and we say, now we're going to be talking about using food as fuel, metabolic fuel. And so we have two forms of fuel, sugar and fat, right? So all of our cellular energetic processes can use as that raw material to create energy, either sugar or fat. And so we have a glycemic, carbohydrate based, glucose mediated pathway of energy production. And then we have a fat, lipid, ketone, fatty acid based one. And most of us, so by definition, we're hybrid engines. We can use two different kinds of fuel for energy. But most of us believe we're gas guzzlers. And when we run out of gas, i.e., when we run out of sugar or carbs, meaning our blood glucose levels drop to a certain threshold, we get hangry and bonky and cranky. And, we have that 3 o'clock crash and all of the things. And we don't have the capacity to say, that's cool. I ran out of gas. I ran out of this fuel. I'll just turn on the battery and go another 100 miles without missing a beat. And so that's where the fasting practice can unlock our capacity to burn our own fat like a furnace. And most of us have completely and utterly shut down the metabolic machinery of fat burning because we are always, at all times, within 3 feet of a refrigerator from the minute that we wake up until we go to bed. And we're doing that constant eating throughout the day. The constant eating throughout the day turns off the signal that our body needs to turn on the ketone burning, the fatty acid burning, the fat burning componentry of our metabolism. So that just goes offline. And it doesn't take long to turn it back on. It takes about 2 weeks, maybe 4 weeks for some people, maybe a little bit longer, but certainly most of us, most of the time, within a month, can regain our ketogenic metabolic machinery. And, the heartbreaking example here that I often give is if you look at a really, really morbidly obese person, um, a lean person has 6 weeks of energy stored as fat, meaning they're not going to starve to death for over a month. Now you take a 400-pound person, they probably have 6 months or longer of energy stored as fat. And so you look at them and you say, brother, you must never be hungry. You have so much excess fuel in your body stored in your fat cells. You must never go hungry. And he'll, of course, tell you, I'm starving all the time. I can't stop thinking about food. I'm starving all the time. What the hell is going on here? Well, very simply, what's going on is that individual has turned off, shut down, disconnected the wires from the part of our metabolism that we all have. We're innately built with the capacity to burn fat. And if we just do some very simple things, the whole point of this series of podcasts is like our bodies need they ask so little of us, right? We don't have to overthink this. But if we simply space out our meals over time, within 2 to 4 weeks, we will we'll reconnect those wires and start reclaiming our innate capacity to burn fat like crazy. Quick example that you'll appreciate. That's a personal one. When I was at my fittest doing Ironman triathlons in my 20s, um, I could never ride at a tempo pace on my bike for more than 55 minutes without starting to bonk.
Interesting.
And so I would need a banana, or back in the days, power bar, or some form of sugar, some form of carbohydrate to fuel my body. Otherwise, I would literally end up in the ditch. I mean, I would bonk so hard that I would go lightheaded. I would almost go blind. I mean, it was pretty bad. Not that long ago, I went on a bike ride that left from my house with a group of guys. There's about 20 of us at 8 a.m. and we hammered for 4 hours. And the only thing that I had was one bottle of water with a little salt. There wasn't a single calorie in that water. And when we finally got back to Boulder, we went to Wonder, and I forgot my wallet. And so all of my friends were eating lunch, and I hadn't even had breakfast. And I had absolutely no bonk or that feeling of lightheadedness or low blood sugar whatsoever. Now, had I been wearing a CGM, I would have probably noted that my blood sugar was quite low, but I didn't feel it. Why? Because I'd become so adapted to burning my own fat in the form of ketones that when I ran low on glucose, my body didn't miss a beat. That would have literally killed me. I would have been, lying somewhere on the side of the road. And it has nothing to do with fitness. I was way fitter in my 20s than I am now in terms of endurance and all of that. This is mediated by meal timing, time restricted feeding, some form of a fasting practice. And if we don't do that, and we can talk about all the ways that we can do that, but if we don't do that, we've literally shut off our ketone metabolism. Has nothing to do with how lean we were. I was super lean, in my 20s. It has nothing to do with fitness. This is all about metabolic what Marxism calls metabolic flexibility, our ability to move from sugar to fat burning very, very fluidly. What say you?
I have more questions than comments at this point because, as a woman who's entered perimenopause,
Mm-hmm.
I've found that my metabolic flexibility has declined
Yeah.
substantially. But on top of that, I've found that my hormones get thrown off from
Yeah.
more aggressive forms of fasting,
Yeah.
or where I used to be able to go at least till 10, if not 11 or
Yeah.
12 before having any meal. Now, my recommended protocol for women in my age bracket is to eat immediately upon waking. Now, we have what is being shown as a fasting like window of time by just
Mm-hmm.
waiting from like an early dinner, say 6 p.m.,
Yeah.
until breakfast, 6, 7 a.m., and that is sufficient in a lot of the current literature for women to fast and get some of those benefits. But I'm just curious, I'm thinking about myself and I'm thinking about even my young daughter, that this is sort of one of those places where it feels like different demographics are going to have really different recommendations, and yet I'd like to have, one, more metabolic flexibility, and two, I'd like to not risk getting hangry if
Mm-hmm.
I'm skipping a meal, but I'm nervous about
Mm-hmm.
throwing my hormones off. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious if you have any sort of thoughts on the complexity, or
Super complex.
yeah.
I think in all of these topics, dogma is not a good policy, and being too, fixated on one way of doing things, since we're all so different, uh, is unhelpful. I really, really appreciate the work that's being done by lots of thinkers in this space. The one who comes to mind most is Dr. Mindy Peltz, who wrote Fast Like a Girl,
Mm-hmm.
and really appreciates and recognizes the importance of looking at not just the fact that women have different hormones than men, but also that they have different hormones that are dominant in different phases of the menstrual cycle.
Yeah.
And that, the luteal phase is not a good time to be rigid about intermittent fasting, whereas the first half of the menstrual cycle may be much more amenable to that. And so she really unpacks the need for some fluidity there. Um, and, you know, Walter Longo is another great resource for people to look at. He's the researcher who's pioneered a lot of this, done beautiful studies, and he has the Prolon diet. And the Prolon diet is, look, for 3 or 4 days a month, don't not eat, don't fast completely, but drop your calories significantly to about 800 calories a day. And so he's got this product that you can purchase called the Prolon diet that um, that offers a lot of the same kinds of benefits as doing it in other ways.
That's fascinating
Yeah.
to me because, as an athlete and someone who is pretty intuitive at this point, I've studied things, tried things, experimented with it, observed my N of one,
Mm-hmm.
and made changes. I noticed that I almost do some of that and just by accident.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's tricky being a coach working with clients because you're needing to teach them, generally speaking, the right way,
Mm-hmm.
but then you're asking them to bake in some variability
Yeah.
in a way that requires them to know themselves.
Yeah.
And that's complicated.
It
So
is.
I'd say a lot of my work as a coach, sure, teaching people what to do, but then giving them the sense of personal autonomy, self-reflection, self-awareness, and permission to go off that, not because of a shadow state, not because of an
Mm.
addiction, not
Mm.
because of cultural patterning in a culture that's unhealthy, but because there's a deep truth inside of them,
Yeah.
or an actual change that's going on that's warranting a response.
I love that. Oh man, I think that's so beautiful and so well said, and I really appreciate you bringing it up. It's essential, I think, to whole human health, which is what we're talking about, and we'll get into that when we talk about the second quadrant of selfhood, reconnecting to self. But I'll just add, I think so much of this is the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle, right?
Sure.
80% is good enough most of the time. It's most of the time. Body's forgiving. There's a time for the warrior stance. There's a time to really hold the samurai sword firmly, and there's a time to surrender a little bit more into that. Um, I think about this in in the example of a glass of wine. A glass of wine. Um, if you're sitting on the back porch during sunset with your beloved, and you're sharing a beautiful glass of wine, it enhances that moment, makes it even more exquisite. Um, if you come home after a super stressful day, you can't wait to uncork the bottle and you feverishly pour yourself a glass and chug it down because you're using it as a form of an escape. Completely different approach to the same exact glass of wine. And so we have to ask ourselves, which you're pointing to, am I offering myself this compromise of the rigidity and the dogma out of a sense of grace, out of a sense of self love, self empowerment, and gratitude and self care, which is necessary and compassionate and beautiful and healthy? Or am I being weak and wobbly and succumbing to my addictions? And the same thing could be, coming from a very different intentionality. So I think we have to be aware of these things, not give ourselves too many free passes. There is a time for discipline for sure. And all of these components of the second pillar of health, of nutrition, require discipline. There's no question. Um, but it doesn't have to be without any uh, ability to flow a little bit with it and dance a little bit with it.
Well, I think dance is a really perfect metaphor
Mhm.
because a dancer is going to have a very disciplined component to
Yeah.
their learning a new performance, learning a new
Mhm.
dance, getting strong enough, eating properly, training, if you will,
Mhm.
most of the time.
Mhm.
But there comes a point where the dance becomes them
Yeah.
and they can just live the dance
Yeah.
and it can just become alive. And I think the same is true with healthy habits.
Yeah.
And when I work with a client where food is our biggest issue, then assuming they don't have a history of eating disorders or disorderly eating that has more psychological
Yeah.
tendencies, I'll encourage them to do macro counting.
Hmm.
Uh, they don't need to macro count for the rest of their life. In fact, if they are, I think something's gone wrong because there's an element of being able to get used to the certain size piece of chicken and how many grams of protein it is. There's a sense of looking at a plate and having it be well balanced and intuitively knowing that. And then there's also this connection between this living food that we're putting in our body and how it makes us feel and making choices based on your body learning how does that food make me feel and then craving the thing that makes you feel good.
Yes.
And so I just bring that up because discipline is often needed at the start.
Hmm.
Things can feel hard to
Yeah.
change at the start. Then there becomes a point where it becomes habitual and
Yeah.
easy. We just want to make sure we've intentionally habitualized the good
The
things.
right things.
And then there's this added layer of intuition that once that truly sets in, creates more opportunity for a fluid dance.
Hmm.
And I always like to give people that full trajectory so that they're not afraid that, oh my God, is my life going to always be rigid and disciplined and hard?
Yeah.
No, the change pieces.
Yeah.
And every once in a while, we got to respin that plate because things gradually migrate towards what culture is doing or gradually migrate towards tendencies, which we all have that, some people have a sweet tooth or, maybe some people gravitate towards staying up a little too late,
Hmm.
whatever it is, we then need to rein it in. It's hard again. And then we go through the cycle one more time.
Totally. I think what you're speaking to is very profound in the sense that there is discipline required on the front end that completely dissolves very, very rapidly. For instance, people who have a sweet tooth, which I can have those tendencies to
Me
beat the
too.
band. Um, but if I'm like, look, for 2 weeks, I'm not going to eat dessert. I'm not going to eat any dessert foods. Um, Reliably, within that 2 week period, the cravings completely disappear. They just stop coming up. I always allow the Michelin star rule. I'm like, if you're in a really nice restaurant and they offer you dessert, don't say no, but just don't do it habitually every night.
Unless you're somebody who's doing reviews at Michelin star restaurants every single night. And that's, again, where the individualized care is,
That's
right?
right.
You have to acknowledge that if you're someone who travels all the time,
Mhm.
travel is not a good off week or
Totally.
deload week
Totally.
because that's your life. I realized that we had hoped to discuss actual caloric recommendations for people, and I thought maybe this would be a good time, speaking to sort of the discipline
Yeah.
component, ideal, give people some goals.
I think that's great. So just to sort of review the 5 components of nutrition, what do I eat? Where does it come from? How much? Calories? When? And personalized nutrition. If we talk about how many calories, I mean, for many people, for a lot of your clients, many of my patients, that's not the issue. Their body mass index is in a healthy range. They're not underweight and they're not overweight. But for lots of Americans, that's not the case. You mentioned there are all kinds of eating disorders, people who don't eat enough, people who eat too much. And so if someone is heavy and they need to lose a bit of weight, a really, really easy way, because I mean, again, we can go down so many paths, but it's important to note that any kind of starvation diet, any too restrictive diet will always yo-yo. I mean, there's so much evidence of this. It's not, I mean, the biosphere, the people that lived in the biosphere in Arizona for 2 years and what happened to them and all of the different caloric restriction diets that caused too much weight loss too fast. I mean, they all rebound. And so that's not the right way. But if you track your calories, which you can do with a MyFitnessPal or other app, and then you say for 10 days, I usually tell people, do it for 10 days. And then divide by 10, get the average. So let's say your average is 2,350 calories a day. Subtract 10%. So subtract 230 calories. And when you hit that threshold every day, say, I'm done eating. You will not feel that. Most people don't notice that they're any more hungry. It goes back to that Japanese principle of 80% is enough. Where we actually don't need those extra 10% of calories, most of us. And while we don't feel it, our bodies will feel that a lot. 200 calories a day times a month, that's a lot of caloric reduction. And so it's not a crash diet, it's not overly restrictive, but it's a very, very simple way to manage those calories. But again, that's not for everybody. Some people actually need to eat more calories. So
Well, I think your approach is really refreshing because I mean, it's pretty common in my industry, which is the health and wellness industry, to give people definitive macro recommendations. And I always like to tell people we need to see what you're doing because even if I use a calculator to determine what you should be eating, in the end, we have to see how you respond to that. So I do something very similar. I like to see where people are at. Um, I guess the biggest difference is kind of what you were speaking to. Most of my clients come to me, and if anything, they're under eating.
yeah,
The percentage of women that under fuel
Yeah.
is devastating.
absolutely.
I heard a statistic recently that within female athletes, 70% are under their caloric needs.
Mhm.
And so that's just sad to me because it doesn't even allow us to see what these women would be capable of as athletes if they were fueling themselves properly. And the biggest, I'd say popular component to this now is making sure women are eating enough protein. And that is a place that I'll get somebody to start counting really quickly. But it's this figure out what you're doing now
Mm-hmm.
and then make an adjustment one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
You know, whether you're trying to bulk and need to increase your
Yep.
calories, whether you're trying to cut your calories to lose weight,
Mm-hmm.
which is only one indication of it's one, you know, one barometer of health and
Right.
not a very good one,
Yep.
or whether you want to stay the same,
Mm-hmm.
you need to know what you're doing first. And most
Mm-hmm.
people have no idea.
That's right.
So it's very informative to just take that. I think 10 days is a wonderful amount of time,
Mm-hmm.
and to make sure it's full days and
Yeah.
make sure you're counting even the bites from your toddler's,
Exactly.
plate or the snacks that you're
Mm-hmm.
grabbing. And, I say something like take 100 calories off, less,
Mm-hmm.
10%. But that's just because, very similar to you, I'm aiming for a sustainable shift.
Yeah.
And not a dramatic change that by its very nature is going to cause a rebellion inside of your body, if not your psychology.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense.
What would you say to the people who are like, I want a number? do you even go there with them, or do you feel like
they get a number.
okay?
You get a number. You got to start with how much are you eating now over 10 days, get that average, and then subtract by 10%. That's a number,
Sure. Do you go into more like specific macro recommendations or protein recommendations? Because in my world and among women, I really find that that's useful. But I'm curious if you feel like that's worth a conversation here
Oh,
today.
100%. The first thing, though, is to talk about doing a deep dive on the main macro that causes the most harm, that's most disordered or dysregulated naturally or civilizationally now, which is carbohydrate. And the best way to go deep into that macro that I recommend for everyone, even very young people, is a CGM. Because a CGM gives you the ability to demystify yourself to yourself in terms of your metabolic needs
So,
and cycles and fluctuations.
so someone who's never thought about using a continuous glucose
Mhm.
monitor, what would you encourage them to do specifically?
Yeah. So the ones that we use, most of them, we usually use the Freestyle Libre 3. That one lasts 2 weeks. I always dispense two, and I tell them the first one that you use, your mind set is one of curiosity, not judgment. You're not trying to fix anything or change anything. You're just curious. You're just revealing and unpacking your metabolic fluctuations as they relate to blood sugar. And so people will start the day, they'll get a fasting blood sugar. They'll be like, oh, okay, this is what I am in the morning before food. Then they'll notice what happens after their first meal, their second meal. And they'll also begin to understand that it's not just food that affects your blood sugar. All of the five pillars affect your blood sugar. So your status of hydration, nutrition, exercise, sleep, and stress reduction will massively impact your blood sugar. If you are eating the exact same thing every single day for 7 days at the same exact time, but one day you're totally dehydrated, one day you're totally sleep deprived, one day you're super stressed out, your blood sugar levels, same exact food, will be very, very, very different. So it's not just the food, but of course the food has a major impact on that. And so just be curious. Just have a state of wonder and awe and say, oh, wow, my body's using this resource and converting it into energy, and this is how it looks. We can begin to start to understand that if I eat these foods in this order, my blood sugar is way higher than if I flip the order. So if I start with a little olive oil and whatever, some salumi, some um, prosciutto before I dive into the bread, um, my body can handle the carb load of that bread on a totally different level, right?
You'll get a kick out of this.
Yeah.
My 4-year-old now knows to like preload with fats and protein before going into sugar.
Hell
So
yeah.
when we go to like a birthday party that inevitably has sugar bombs that we don't usually do, she will come up to me, Mom, I had my full turkey sandwich or whatever
That's
it
a
is that she said.
well-educated kid right there.
Well, she also knows she goes bonkers and
Yes.
doesn't feel good. So
Yes.
the correlating how you feel with what is physically happening in your body and the action that you took to cause that is incredibly empowering.
Yeah.
And if a 4-year-old can do it, so can you.
Yeah, I can't agree more. I'd love to hear how you deal with the other macros, but that's a great way to start with, carbohydrates and very briefly with fats and proteins. We spent some time talking about the three different kinds of fat. So saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, polyunsaturated fat, and the importance of altering our omega-3 to 6 ratio. And we do that by removing seed oils primarily and focusing on well-sourced food that we discussed. And then we talk about protein, and most people, I would say, probably need a little bit more than they're eating in general. But I think that Peter Attia caused a bit of a shitstorm when he told people that they have to eat a gram of protein for every pound of body weight. I think that's too much for most people. It's more than they need. And, again, if you are a professional bodybuilder who's competing on stage, you may need that or more. But most of us don't need quite that much. But finding that balance between the three certainly does matter. And so, yeah, tell us how you do that.
Well, I think even going into your comment about these recommendations and how that can create a problem in, quote, the average person or a regular person, because so many of the podcasters and influencers are giving recommendations, and their recommendations are based on an ideal, but the ideal isn't happening in a vacuum.
Yeah.
So I do think that the 1 gram per ideal body weight is a good protein recommendation, assuming you're also, like you said, lifting a lot of weights, intentionally building muscle, having a generally active lifestyle, walking a significant amount. But most Americans in particular are doing maybe 8% of what I just described. So encouraging them to just eat more is going to create more problems than good. That said, again, for the demographic I work with, I mostly work with women over 35. They have been under eating for decades. They've been yo-yo dieting, and they've been predominantly over cardioing without lifting enough weights. So getting them to build muscle becomes the lowest hanging fruit for making metabolic improvements. And to get enough muscle on them to do that, we need them eating enough protein.
Amen.
So if I have the option of, or like the ability to truly create change to somebody's entire lifestyle and their overall health, I am typically focusing on this concept of whole foods, like we discussed, and having them focus on protein to build muscle so that they can ... And I say ... because it's so many things. Protect against Alzheimer's. If they're lifting weights and building muscle, they're probably also supporting bone health. And perhaps most importantly, based on what I'm seeing, improve their metabolic health. So I do typically have my clients aiming for that at least 1 gram of protein per ideal pound of body weight, but that's not happening in a vacuum, right? And so personally, as I hit perimenopause, I actually had to increase my protein even beyond that. And the timing of the protein became really important. There's some really interesting science right now that is talking about like protein synthesis and triggering protein synthesis, and how when you're older that requires a higher hit of a singular meal of protein, and that 30 grams of protein is kind of this ideal number. When I started implementing that in my own life, having breakfast that included at least 30 grams of protein, brain fog dissipated, afternoon energy slumps gone, and all of a sudden I could start working out in the gym harder, which led to greater gains and everything else improving. I'm seeing the same thing among most of my female clients. This isn't something I've had a chance to explore with men
Mm.
as much, but I'm curious if individuals over 70 might have a similar response, because often you're dealing with insufficient muscle mass.
Yeah.
And I'm finding consistent conversation among scientists right now who are doing work in the women's health field, which is that you often have a benefit from one choice that has some risks, and you have to compare it to something else that has its own benefits and risks. So in the space of it, fasting versus eating a big breakfast, these muscle gains versus this metabolic flexibility, which is more important? I don't think either is more important if you just, again, put it in a vacuum. What's most important for that individual at that stage of their life and that sort of level and place in their healing? So again, for a lot of women in this category, we need to get a bunch of muscle on them. But once we've got the muscle on them, we have more of a vibrant, healthy, responsive system that we can play with. So I tend to work on getting muscle in somebody's body before I put them into a calorie restriction and have them lose fat, or before I'm having them do anything over a 12-hour fasting cycle. But that means I have to have their attention and their focus for over a year. And not everybody has that level of discipline or financial opportunity to stick with a coach for that long. So it's a complicated question is what I'm trying to say, but too much refined sugar is going to make somebody sick. You get enough protein in somebody's body and have them only eating whole foods, they almost can't eat too much. So that's where I think the way you look at this and what you're changing about somebody's overall diet, the order you're doing it in, has its own innate genius, because by the time they've eaten exclusively whole foods, by the time they've really started looking at what they're putting on their plate, where it came from, and connecting with the vibrancy of locally grown and raised food, or at least pesticide-free food when possible. If you can also introduce this concept of sufficient protein, you almost don't need to go any further. Like, people's diet seems to naturally just sort of stabilize into the macros that are ideal. I don't know. I mean, there is an element of tuning to the body through fitness that I think makes this even more of a healthy system that I'm describing. But that's kind of how I look at it, is just make sure they're hydrated, make sure we're eating whole foods, and just gently improving.
Yes.
That's my philosophy generally, is better is better. Let's make micro improvements. Don't let better be the enemy of, or what is it, perfection be the enemy of the good. So that's my answer to your question.
It's really, really well said. And I completely resonate with all of it. I think it's in the context of these things. These things don't have to be overwrought, overcomplicated. They don't need to take a PhD to figure out. They can be implemented into our lives with very, very little effort. And so drinking enough water to make our urine clear, the eating the right foods that come from the right place at the right time, in the right amount, tending to our personalized idiosyncrasies as our digestive systems are unique, and also moving the body, and also resting the body, and also knowing how to manage stress on an embodied way, in an embodied way. So how do I regulate my autonomic nervous system so that I actually have the neurocircuitry to digest the food? Because a completely stressed out person actually has a disordered autonomic nervous system that prevents healthy digestion of food. So all of these things that we're going to be unpacking in this podcast series, with the intention of presenting them in a way that's actually really simple to integrate, with a little effort, that gets the wheel spinning in the right direction, and so that the vicious cycle that most of us are caught in can start spinning in the other direction, and each intervention builds on the next, There's a momentum that's produced. That's what it's all about. The one thing that I'd love to add to what you said so beautifully is, of course, we don't have a study on this, but I believe that one of the most important reasons to do this is your IQ. I believe that if you implement what we just talked about, these five, concepts of food, and you regain metabolic flexibility of some degree, you figure out where your food comes from and you're eating more and more real food. Most people say that, oh my God, my brain is so much more clear. Oh my God, my memory, word recall, cognitive processing speed just seems so fluid. And I bet that if we measured this quantitatively, we would find that most of us gain 5 to 10 IQ points
I couldn't agree more.
for making these simple changes, which is like, that alone is so freaking huge, right?
When you take into consideration the improvements on end of life well-being,
Yeah.
and the sheer quality of life almost immediately from making these choices, you have all the incentive in the world to start caring for yourself.
Yeah.
And so while there is that initial hurdle of making change generally, see it as a simple one step at a time.
Yeah.
Like we said, looking at the boxes and bags inside of your cupboards and choosing alternatives for each one of these. Again, doesn't have to be everything overnight.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the, in some of in our podcast series, putting a glass of water next to your bed and starting the hydration process early.
Yeah.
Going out for a singular additional walk each day. These small improvements will increase your intelligence, helping you make better decisions, helping you make the next micro adjustment to your life, and the feedback loop continues.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I want to challenge people to do, is to almost gamify it if necessary.
Yeah.
How good can you feel?
Yeah.
Because the better you feel, and not just the throw a drink back, feel good in the moment and feel awful tomorrow, but sustainably improve your life. How high can your vibration get?
Yes.
Because we don't even know it's possible if we have a society full of happy, healthy, vibrant people. The decisions they'll make as a collective will also be improved.
That is health sovereignty. That is freedom. And we ain't selling, right?
Yeah.
How many things did we talk about today that require gadgets? Maybe a CGM, and those are cheap. So much of this really is fairly elemental, and I really appreciate this conversation. This was super helpful for me. I learned a lot from the way that you think through these things, and hopefully it was helpful to our audience as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.